All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into something truly wild, empirical eating, and the bizarre menus of 19th century science. You know, when we picture the great minds of the Victorian era, we usually imagine these highly dignified scientists peering intensely through microscopes, right? Or maybe carefully cataloging taxidermy in a dusty museum. What we absolutely do not picture is what these guys were actually putting on their dinner plates.
So picture this, you're a very lucky guest invited to the home of a prominent, incredibly wealthy 19th century British naturalist. You sit down at this gorgeously set mahogany table, the silver is gleaming, the candles are lit, and this is what they serve you. Toasted mice, battered hedgehog, a nice bowl of elephant trunk soup, maybe some roast giraffe, and, I'm not kidding, even partially rotted panther. This isn't a joke and it's not some crazy menu from a fantasy novel. These were actual, literal delicacies consumed by the educated elite of the time. It really paints this vivid and honestly pretty grotesque picture of a very specific kind of feast.
And get this, we're not just talking about a handful of random, unknown eccentrics doing this in the shadows. Even Charles Darwin. Yes, Charles Darwin, arguably one of the most famous figures in all of scientific history, was a part of this movement. While he was studying at Cambridge University, Darwin was a member of a dining society literally called the Glutton Club. Their officially stated goal? To meet up every single week to seek out and consume what they referred to as strange flesh. The contrast here is just absolutely amazing. You have these individuals with incredibly prestigious scientific reputations, men who are quite literally writing the textbooks on the natural world, actively engaging in these bizarre, totally gluttonous culinary hobbies.
Which brings us to the central mystery we really need to solve today. Why on earth were esteemed men of science chowing down on owls, crocodiles, and howler monkeys? It is super easy to just chalk this all up to extreme wealth, just pure extravagance or a Victorian eccentricity. But if we actually dig into the psychology and the history of the era, we find out there was a highly logical, deeply serious motivation behind this seemingly absurd gluttony.
To figure out their motives, we kind of have to set the historical stage. Two massive things were happening in Britain at the time. First, in 1828, the Regent's Park Zoo opened up. This meant an unprecedented, steady influx of exotic animals pouring into the country. Second, right around the mid-19th century, urban populations in cities like London were absolutely booming, which created a very real, very pressing problem. Basically, how do you feed all these people? Well, these two seemingly totally unrelated historical facts ended up colliding in the minds of the era's naturalists.
And the logic they used to connect the zoo to the food crisis was surprisingly pretty practical. At the time, the science of natural history was super focused on osteology, which is just the study of bones. So when an animal unfortunately died at this early zoo, scientists would dissect it to get the skeleton, and literally tons of exotic flesh were just being thrown away every year. Why? Because the meat was considered scientifically useless. Well, a few clever naturalists saw a golden opportunity to make science a bit more practical. They cooked up a plan. Take this discarded meat, figure out how to domesticate these foreign species right there on British soil, and then flood the market with all this new meat. The ultimate, rather noble goal was to lower the cost of meat across the board and make it affordable for the working poor.
This whole effort to domesticate foreign species became known as acclimatization, and the wealthy elites went all in. They essentially turned their massive private estates into giant experimental farms for exotic dining. The sheer scale of it was just staggering. Take Edward Smith Stanley, the Earl of Derby. He converted his park at Knowsley Hall into a sprawling menagerie of 345 mammals, all intended for consumption. The Duke and Duchess of Bedford, they introduced over 73 new species of ruminants to Woburn Abbey. And Walter Lionel Rothschild was out there raising ostriches and kangaroos. They honestly truly believed that since global trade and colonization were opening up the world, the everyday British dinner plate should expand right along with it.
But, of course, there was a massive roadblock. How exactly do you convince the stubborn British public to eat a capybara? Or a kangaroo? The exotic animal eaters knew perfectly well that the culinary prejudices of the English people were going to be their biggest obstacle. So these naturalists stepped up and appointed themselves as the objective arbiters of taste. They believed it was their strict scientific duty to personally sample everything so they could objectively determine which exotic animals were good enough and cheap enough for widespread British consumption.
Now, the deeper psychological mindset that drove them to literally consume their own research, that all comes down to 19th century empiricism. This is the incredibly firm belief that all scientific knowledge has to rely on experimentation, observation, and most importantly, direct experience through our senses. If you wanted to truly know something, like really understand it in Georgian and Victorian Britain, you couldn't just read about it. You had to experience it directly.
See, during the long 18th century and rolling right into the 19th, there is this widespread creeping anxiety that your vision alone could easily deceive you. Think about it. An artifact might look incredibly light to your eyes, but then be super heavy when you actually try to lift it. Or a surface that looks perfectly smooth might feel remarkably rough to the touch. Because the eyes and the hands could be tricked so easily, the 19th century scientist genuinely believed that to truly, completely know an object, you had to use absolutely every single sense available to you.
And yes, you guessed it, that absolutely included the sense of taste. Which brings us to the wonderfully eccentric English naturalist William Buckland. Now, Buckland was widely respected in the scientific community, but he took this empirical mandate to its absolute extreme. He famously declared that his life's goal was to eat his way straight through the whole of animal creation. While that sounds completely absurd, maybe even unhinged to us today, within the strict logical framework of 19th century empiricism, eating exotic animals was actually a highly consistent, rigorous pursuit of scientific truth.
So the really crucial point to grasp here is just how completely differently they viewed the human tongue compared to how we view it today. Today, we all know taste is highly personal, right? If we try some weird new food, we might just shrug and say, tastes like chicken. It's totally subjective. But for naturalists like Buckland, the tongue was a precise, objective, scientific instrument. An item's flavor wasn't some subjective feeling, it was hard, undeniable evidence. You could discern it, document it, and categorize it exactly the same way you would a bone structure or a feather pattern. The tongue was quite literally a tool for gathering knowledge.
To really drive home just how incredibly far they took this, there is this fascinating, almost unbelievable historical incident known as the Cathedral Miracle. So the story goes that a local cathedral was loudly boasting about a miracle occurring on their grounds. Mysterious splotches of what the locals enthusiastically claimed was martyr's blood were suddenly appearing all over the cathedral flagstones. William Buckland, being a dedicated man of science, felt it was his absolute duty to investigate this extraordinary claim. So he packs up and travels down to the cathedral to investigate these mysterious spots.
And how exactly did he investigate? By busting out his ultimate scientific instrument, of course. Buckland literally drops down to his hands and knees on the cathedral floor and touches his tongue directly to the flagstones. After tasting the so-called martyr's blood, he stands up and proudly proclaims, "I can tell you what it is. It is bat's urine." Now just take a second to consider the massive implication here. For better or worse, in order for Buckland to confidently identify that substance on the spot and debunk the entire miracle, he must have already known exactly what bat urine tasted like. He didn't just accept prepackaged explanations, he literally empirically tasted the world to know it.
So, what was the ultimate outcome of all this intense empirical tasting and these grand, sprawling acclimatization projects? Well, ultimately, it was a massive failure of the palate. For all the incredible wealth poured into those menageries, and all the strange flesh enthusiastically consumed by the Glutton Club and men like Buckland, the standard British diet did not fundamentally change. You didn't start seeing roast giraffe or panther down at the local pub.
The whole movement basically collapsed for a few very logical, practical reasons. First off, the exotic animals were just way too expensive to continually import. Furthermore, it turns out that exotic species are incredibly difficult to actually domesticate in the gloomy, wet British climate. Who knew? But the absolute biggest factor was just the general public. They absolutely, flat out refused to experiment with their dinners. The conservative, traditional tastes of the everyday British citizen completely won out over the naturalist's grand scientific schemes. In fact, out of all these elaborate, incredibly expensive projects, the only notable, lasting agricultural success from this entire era of experimentation was the development of fish hatcheries.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating perspective shift to chew on. These Georgian and Victorian naturalists sincerely, truly believed they were doing objective, cutting-edge science by eating their way through the animal kingdom. They used their tongues to measure the world around them. So my question to you is this: what perfectly accepted, totally normal, modern dietary or scientific practices that we engage in today will look like bizarre gluttony or just pure madness to people looking back at us 200 years from now? It's a pretty striking thought to end on, isn't it? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and remember, keep questioning exactly how we know what we know.